is everyone ready? Yeah, so I'd like to begin with a brief off-time roadmap. I'll start with going over some framework, and then 3 advantages, and then some impact calculus at the end. So let's go ahead and start time. Today we stand in firm affirmation of the resolution. The United States federal government should impose economic sanctions on Venezuela. We're going to start off by defining this round as a policy round because of the keyword should, and it's asking the federal government to take an action. It's asking it to impose economic sanctions on Venezuela. We're going to let the weighing mechanism in today's round be net benefits, and the plan text is as follows. We're going to impose the following sanctions on Venezuela, and a sanction is pretty much defined as anything that disrupts the normal flow of money between 2 countries. So what we're going to be doing is freezing the $3.8 billion of Venezuelan assets within the United States. Now, most of these assets come from the rich that are investing within the United States economy. We're going to simply be freezing these assets, and the time frame is going to be until they start cooperating with us on the DEA. So the DEA is the United States Drug Enforcement Agency. So in 2005, Venezuela pretty much cut off all relationships with the DEA, and recently there were talks to get these relationships started again, so our Drug Enforcement Agency could start working with the Venezuelan government once again. But because of the recent protests and the Venezuelan government accusing the United States of playing a key role in backing the opposition, they started to stop these talks. So our condition is going to be, we're going to stop these economic sanctions only when the DEA is working with the Venezuelan government once again. Yeah?
Could you tell us if these $3.8 billion of assets, are they mainly belonging to like the people supporting the government or the opposition?
It's pretty much varied around, but the vast majority of the people with these assets are the rich, and most of them hold either political office or have strong ties with the government. They lobby the government. So they are actually pretty much mostly on the government side, although there are a few on the other side as well. And then the cost for this policy, pretty much, it's not going to actually cost any real money other than the executional cost, which will not exceed more than $1 million, and the funding is going to be through normal ways and means, which is pretty much the sale of treasury bonds. So with that being said, that's all we have on framework. Does the opposing team have any questions? No. Okay, let's go right into advantage number 1. So starting with drugs. So tagline, the United States will be better able to crack down on drug trafficking. Subpoint A, uniqueness. 90% of cocaine that goes into the United States comes through Venezuela. So 90% of the cocaine that's actually traveling through South America that's coming to the United States is coming through Venezuela. And this is 17% of the world trade in cocaine. Now, in 2005, when we cut off relations with the DEA, this actually quadrupled. So there's 4 times as much cocaine passing through Venezuela as there was before we had these relationships with the DEA. And these statistics come right from the United States Congress. So what we can conclude off of this uniqueness, this observation on the status quo, that Venezuela is a huge area where lots and lots of drugs are passing through, and also after our relations were, after the DEA's relationships with the Venezuelan government were cut off, this drug trade grew exponentially. So let's go right into subpoint B, link. If we can resume these relations that we had in 2005 and before, if the DEA can start working with the Venezuelan government today, when our policy passes through, if we can resume these relationships and start making some meaningful change in Venezuela, start cracking down on gangs, start cracking down on groups that traffic these drugs, we can actually see a reduction in the drug trade. And then let's take that right into subpoint C, impact. First of all, this reduced the amount of cocaine coming into the United States of America, and we have positive health impact there. We're pretty much, here are some of the detriments of cocaine. It decreases dopamine levels in normal people. It results in lots of heart attacks and strokes and nose palms and whatnot. So it's obviously very unhealthy for citizens, and by limiting the amount of cocaine we're having, we're improving the health of our citizens, and we can internalize this into a reduction of suffering, because being unhealthy causes you to suffer, and by preserving the health of our citizens, we're reducing suffering. Also, let's go ahead and talk about loss of life here. 28,000 people die in Venezuela due to the drug trade every single year, and on top of that, 5,000 in the United States die just because of cocaine. They're killed just because of cocaine. Now, on top of that, cocaine causes lots of drug activity within the gang activity within the United States of America, and because of that, there's lots more violence as well. So you should factor that in as well. So we can internalize this right into a loss of life. We're saving lives by reducing the drug trade. What's actually going to be happening is that less people are going to be dying because of cocaine overdose, and at the same time, there'll be less gang activity, there'll be less criminal activity, and less shootings and whatnot going on, so we're saving lives there. And that should be weighed more than anything else in today's round, because you can only improve the quality of life on the premise that life actually exists, so therefore the value of life ought to be weighed above everything else. Contention number 2 is that of foreign relations. Tagline, Venezuela, we will be improving the Venezuelan-U.S. relationship. Subpoint A, uniqueness. Currently, Venezuela has desired to improve relations within with the United States of America. Like I said before, these were on pause because of the recent protests going on. Now, the U.S. kind of has this possibility of being negligent right now and in the past, but we should be acting more actively on these and start resuming our proper trade with the country of Venezuela. And subpoint B, link, the way we're going to be doing this is, first of all, once we start having the DEA work with the Venezuelan government, then we can move on to more sorts of progress. Once these countries are working together again, we can start getting different branches of our government working with different branches of theirs, and we can start resuming a healthier relationship with the country of Venezuela. So let's go right into subpoint C, impact. Let's give you a little bit more background information right now. 8.2% of our oil comes from Venezuela, and also the Venezuelan GDP is $300 billion, ours is $16.2 trillion, so therefore Venezuela has a lot to benefit for trade with us. So pretty much they have incentives to go through this as well. So we're going right into subpoint C, impact. First of all, like we already mentioned before, we're going to be decreasing the drug trade, not only through DEA relations, but also through relationships with other organizations and overall healthier relationship with Venezuela. We already impacted on that. But also the second of all, we're going to be pretty much having another reliable source of oil, which is really good because our economy is oil-based. If we have cheaper oil prices, the cost of manufacturing goes down. That drops down cost floors, and thus our economy becomes a lot healthier. And we can tie that right into the financial stability of our citizens, because when our economy is doing better, they have better financial stability. And we can terminalize this in 2 ways. First and foremost, according to CBS News, the #1 cause of worry within the United States is financial instability. So by reducing worrying, we're reducing suffering, but also at the same time, 4,500 individuals die every single year due to financial instability, so we can start saving lives here as well. And then finally going to a third contention really quick, this is going to be improving the United States image. Tagline, the common Venezuelan people will start supporting the United States. Subpoint A, uniqueness, 31%, only 31% of the Venezuelan people support our government right now. Subpoint B, by A, improving relations with Venezuela, but also taking actions against the rich that are pretty much manipulating the government in Venezuela, the common average man in Venezuela will actually start supporting the United States once we had an 82% approval rate amongst the common people. And subpoint C, impact, this is going to help our trade. This will also reduce terrorism. There will be less people hating on the United States and Venezuela, and we can terminalize this by improving the quality of life and saving lives. So for all of these reasons, I urge the strongest ballot in favor of the affirmative.
None of you need time signals, right?
No, we're good.
Alright, the order is going to be 2 off, CP, AC.
Repeat.
2 off,
Okay.
CP, AC. Alright. Is everyone ready? Alright, starting time now. We negate the resolution. USFG should impose economic sanctions on Venezuela. The first to decide is oil shock. President Nicolas Maduro just three days ago urged the U.S. not to impose sanctions on Venezuela. Instead of its sanctions were placed, appropriate responses would be taken. Specifically, Maduro threatened to stop U.S. oil exports. So the U.S. gets 19.6% of its oil from Venezuela right now, and that's more than we're getting from OPEC. The plan here is that the U.S. actually does impose sanctions under the plan. So we can see that Maduro is going to follow through with his threat, and that the U.S. is going to lose a major supplier of oil. The impact here is that shutting off oil from Venezuela would be catastrophic to the United States economy. Right now, the Venezuelan analysis estimates that the U.S. could lose up to $300 billion in lost oil. So obviously here, if we have like this huge lack of oil, this huge deficit, the production costs and everything that we actually use oil to like benefit our economy would go down. The second impact is that we're supporting terrorism, because if we back off of Latin American oil, specifically Venezuela, the only other option we can turn to is OPEC countries in the Middle East. And right now, most of the oil that these Middle Eastern countries, that profit is being used to fund terrorism. Specifically in 2010, $60 million of Middle Eastern oil profits suddenly disappeared, and what happened was there was a surge in the terrorist activity at that time. Specifically, Iran continued to beefed up its nuclear program after we had to back off of Latin American oil and then focus more on OPEC oil. So Hezbollah, the activity in Hezbollah increased too when we had to turn towards Syria. So what we can see is that every time the U.S. is forced to back off of one of their main suppliers of oil, we have to look towards the Middle East, and each and every single time we do that, terrorism is proliferated. I'll take your first POI.
Yeah. Why wouldn't the United States just improve upon its oil trade with Canada if, in the first place, Venezuela even cut off the oil trade?
That's not unique non-unique. That could happen in both the AC or the NC. It really doesn't matter. They could do that. You could. I mean, that argument's non-unique. I could say that on your case too. So now let's go on to the second dissent, which is violence proliferation. A is uniqueness. According to Amnesty International, the Venezuelan forces have been holding back. Only 36 people have died as a result of the protests in Venezuela, but the potential casualties are far greater. So right now, Venezuela is acting fairly light towards the protesters, using mainly methods of crowd dispersion, such as tear gas and intimidation, rather than actual violence. Like, they're not using guns, but instead they're just using intimidation tactics. They act lightly in an attempt to keep good relations with the rest of the world. They want to look more favorable. The link here is that the plan basically cuts off ties with the Western world, because then they'll realize that the West doesn't like us. All this attempt that we've been making this whole time for the West to actually improve relations and the West to actually favor us will be cut off. There's basically going to be no incentive to stop them from not using weapons of that could actually kill people. So the impact here is that if Maduro realizes that there is no reason to play for anymore because there's no international body to appeal to, he's going to authorize violence to stop the protests. And obviously that's bad, because the thing that we don't want to resort to is violence being used in the protests. Next, let's go on to the CP. The CP is that the Vatican City will send Cardinal Pietro Parolin to Venezuela to act as an international arbiter. The time frame is immediately, and the funding will be provided by normal ways and means. So first, let's start off with a couple observations on the status quo. Right now, Maduro is willing to come to peaceful talks with the opposition. However, the opposition has boycotted any attempts at cooperative dialogue with the Maduro regime. Specifically, on February 27th, Maduro held a peace conference to reconcile with the opposition. The leader of the Democratic Unity Roundtable, Henry Capriles, has boycotted talks, citing a lack of transparency and a neutral third party in the negotiation of the talks. Observation 2 is that both sides are willing to negotiate if one condition is met. Maduro said on Thursday that he was willing to sit down with the opposition under an outside observer. Specifically, he cited Cardinal Pietro Parolin as a favorite to pave the way for talks. Because he said, and the Cardinal already agreed to this, he said he's more than willing to actually come to Venezuela and help negotiate talks. So what we're left here is, because the U.S. can't go, because obviously the U.S. approval rating in Venezuela is right now, the only option that we're looked to is Vatican diplomacy. And remember, this is going to work both times, because essentially both sides contend to this. Maduro himself has cited Vatican diplomacy, and the Vaticans are willing to come to Venezuela. So the first advantage of the CP is that Venezuela improves. So it would lead Maduro to meet the demands of the opposition. Maduro stated himself that he wants to learn the needs of the opposition without violence protest. That's exactly what the CP is doing. So if this happens, we're only left to assume that the opposition would actually meet, some of their demands would be met, and their first demand right now is they want Maduro to hold elections early, because right now under the status quo, Venezuela can't hold the next presidential elections until 2016. But if we were to do this, potentially Maduro could hold elections early, because that's what they don't. That's what they want. They don't want to oust Maduro completely. Rather, what they want him to do is lose in democratic elections, and ultimately that's going to be improving governmental legitimacy. Because if we see that Maduro is elected democratically rather than just put in power because he's similar to Chavez, that's going to make Venezuela look a lot more legitimate in the eyes of countries, and ultimately that's going to be better for foreign relations in Venezuela. The second advantage is Catholicism is good. So because Vatican is it's a more religious, there's no geopolitical interest involved, and they're only focusing on negotiating the problem. It spreads charity and altruism, because that's what the Pope advocates for. It gives a chance for Vatican diplomacy to step in and promote Catholicism, which would ultimately promote more charity and altruism. Now let's go on to the AC. So starting with their plan text, they said that they're going to freeze $3.8 billion in assets until they cooperate with the DA. The problem here is that we don't want to cooperate with the DA. Right now, what the Affirmative doing is they're prioritizing drug enforcement over government legitimacy in a possible rebellion. The DEA would, on their first contention about drugs, we have two responses. The first is that the DEA wouldn't negotiate. If we look towards Plan Colombia, in which the DEA actually tried to stop cocaine trade, what happened was the DEA actually left the economy of Colombia in shambles. They used inefficient pesticides to try to stop cocaine, but they really didn't stop anything. Instead, these pesticides, they didn't really stop cocaine growth. Instead, what they did is just hurt the indigenous population, because they're built they're essentially poison. So they use airplanes to spread this instead of just spraying them on plants, and that's what hurt the indigenous population. All of them were run over by these pesticides, and that's what's going to be happening now, because this is the only instance in where the DEA has stepped into Latin America in an attempt to try to stop or mitigate the drug trade. The second advantage is, sorry, I have a lot to get through. I'm not going to be taking any questions. On their second advantage about foreign relations and how they're desired to improve, well, right now, remember, they stated themselves that 31% of the U.S. only has a 31% approval rating in Venezuela right now, and 80% of that comes from the opposition. But the problem is that they're supporting the government in this situation. So only U.S. approval rating would only go down, because they're not supporting the side that we really want to support. Now onto their third advantage about how we're going to be improving the U.S. image, you can turn this argument, because instead of like making the U.S. look better, it's going to make the U.S. look a lot worse, because instead of prioritizing government legitimacy and stopping a possible rebellion, they're going to be prioritizing stopping drug trade, which is going to make the U.S. look completely ridiculous at a time where there's like a huge protest in Venezuela. But second, this assumes that the DA is effective, and you can look towards Colombia and see that the DA isn't effective. And it's for all these reasons that I urge strong vote here for the neg. Thank you.
Quick off-time roadmap. We're going to go through their contentions, their counter plan, and then their responses to us. All right. Ready? You guys ready? Yeah. All right. Be it resolved, the United States federal government should impose sanctions on Venezuela. We're in the firmest affirmation of this. Our plan text as reads. All right. So first, let's go to the first contention, which is oil shock. And they said that there's going to be, U.S. could lose oil. There's going to be supporting terrorism. But actually, I'd like to cross-reference this to our contention 3, subpoint 3, where we come up here and we actually say in our subpoint 3 that the Venezuelan people supporting the United States will actually lead to less terrorism because there's no anti-American sentiment there. So that's the biggest response to that. Also, a second response to oil shock is that oil is a lot more important to the Venezuelan government than it is to the United States in terms of how much oil we're getting. We're getting about 8.2% of our oil from Venezuela, while Venezuela is exporting 40% of its GDP in oil to the United States. What does this mean? If we impose these sanctions on the Venezuelan government, all that means it's going to put a bigger shock on their economy than it puts on the United States. As my partner brought up, we can get oil from other sources, such as Canada, which is not in the OPEC. We can get oil from other sources, not only in Venezuela. So what this finally comes down to is that U.S. will not be using oil. This will have a bigger impact on the Venezuelan government, and as a result, they're going to comply with our plan text, which is a regulation with the DEA. Yes.
Is the U.S. also getting more oil from Canada under the AC, under the plan text?
No. It's just a possible condition. Second with that is we see their violence proliferation. That was their second contention. First, let's look at their uniqueness. 36 people dead, and they talk about potentially more. Again, this is speculation. We cannot just say that, oh, because 36 people died, more people are going to die in the future. We need hard evidence. Only 36 people have died. Second is that, look, we're freezing the assets of the rich. Okay, this is not the common protester. If we freeze the assets of the rich, our main point here and our main impact here is that's going to influence the government. That's going to influence them to better relations with the United States, and also it's going to persuade them to stop this drug trade, to put down on this drug trade with the DEA. Then we go on to the counter plan. They said the immediate arbiter of Vatican City, I believe, and then they said they want talks. Again, this is a topicality issue. This has nothing to do with economic sanctions. Yeah, that could be the byproduct of better talks. Could be, better economic stability and better government in the future. But right now, this is not topical. So essentially, I'd like to run theory line 1, which is topicality. The first part of this is the violation of this, and essentially they're going completely off topic. They're saying, oh, we're going to have these peace talks, but that has nothing to do with economic sanctions. The second with that is their interpretation. We say this is wrong to do, this is not on topic. The third is the standard. Essentially what standards this sets is that the negation can come up here and run any counterplan they want, as long as it's not something on the affirmation. They can be completely off topical, and if something completely off topical is better than the very constricted AF resolution, then they win the round. That's not fair. That doesn't give us any grounds to debate on. And so fourth and finally is the fairness aspect and the education aspect. They have so many grounds to debate on, and then they're not even debating on the topicality of on the topic of the issue. Therefore, we have a topicality theory on them, and you can run this this impact that we'll bring up in the next speeches of not enough education. With that, well, let's go to my case, or my partner and I's case. First, they talked about our plan. They talked about the possible rebellion. I don't see how the possible rebellion would happen. They're talking about the protesters, except you have to understand we're freezing the assets of the rich. When we freeze the assets of the rich, that forces the Venezuelan government to do something, because my partner brought up that the rich in Venezuela have a lot of control on the government. So if we impose these sanctions, if we freeze these assets, that's going to take a big toll on the rich, and the government's going to do something about that. Now let's go to contention 1. I'd like to note right away that they did not affect subpoint 1, and they did not attack subpoint C. uniqueness and impact. You can cross this all the way through through your flow sheet, because silence is consent. They had the opportunity to come up and address it, and they did not address it. All they did was attack our link, and all they said was the DEA would not negotiate, and they're inefficient. One thing I'd like to remind you was that the DEA and Venezuela did work up until 2005. They worked very, very successfully. Actually, what happened was after the DEA got out of Venezuela, the amount of cocaine quadrupled, and the reason that DEA got out of Venezuela was because of Hugo Chavez and his policies, except now we have a new leader in Maduro, and Maduro does want better peace talks, and he does want to cooperate with the DEA, and I think that's a very, very important impact as we go on with this. Again, note that our impact is terminalized of reducing suffering and saving lives. They have not attacked this at all, if we can follow that impact all the way through the flow sheet. Now the second is this foreign relations topic. Again, our uniqueness and our impact, subpoint A and subpoint C, were not attacked, especially financial stability and the 44,500 individuals dead due to financial stability. The rationale behind this is that if people don't have money, they don't have the ability to make rational decisions. They don't have the, they may not have money, or they may be in such situations where they cannot make rational decisions, and often that leads to death. Again, they don't attack uniqueness or impact. All they said was that the United States approving rating would actually go down, except we don't see how this would exactly happen, because what we're saying is we're just freezing the assets of the rich. That is not the common man. The common man is not the rich person, and we're talking to the government, and we're going to cut down on these drugs, and everyone wants to be cut down on drugs, and that's exactly what the common man has expressed specifically. Yes.
So if you're supposedly only cutting off the assets of the rich people, why would any financial instability hurt the rich people if they already have enough money to support themselves?
Because all we said was that this increases the foreign relation. We're saying that if we don't do this, that's going to affect the common man. That was our point on that. Now, the third is the image of the United States. They said the United States is going to look a lot worse. Again, they did not attack a uniqueness of 31% people only supporting Venezuela, and our impact on terrorism. All they said was that the United States is going to look worse. Again, don't see how that's going to happen, because we're imposing sanctions on the rich, this government that the protesters don't like. So the protesters don't like this government. There's not going to be a decrease in approval rating. In fact, there's going to be an approval and an increase in approval rating, and that's like that. Now, with the remaining time, about a minute left, I'd like to go back to their case and turn both their arguments onto our side. First, let's talk about this oil shock. They said that this oil shock would make it worse for the United States. Therefore, we should not impose a sanction. Nicolas Maduro does not want a sanction, and he said he will take any necessary steps. Well, I ask you, who does this affect more? And that's the point I want to get back to. This is going to affect the Venezuelan government a lot more than it's going to affect the United States government. So there's not going to be an oil shock in the United States, because they can get oil from whenever else they want. The Venezuelan government, which exports 40% of its oil to the United States, will not be able to import it anywhere else, or export it anywhere else. They need this relation with the United States, and if we can get the DEA with the United States to work together with the Venezuelan government, that is going to be the optimal result. So we're actually going to turn this and say that, look, this is going to be positive for us, because it's going to affect the Venezuelan government more than it affects the United States government, because the United States government has a plethora of ways to go ahead and get this oil. The second is, not this time, the second is this violence proliferation. They see more people are going to see violence, but actually we're going to say there's going to be less people with violence, and the reason for this is because there's a more stable government, because there's a DEA, and this DEA is cracking down on these drugs, and when he's cracking down on drugs, we see a better, stable government. For all these reasons, I vote for an affirmative ballot.
So the order is going to be... Alright, so the order is going to be, I'm going to be covering the AC, and then NC, and then count. Alright, is everyone ready? Yeah. Alright, so... Alright, so starting time now. So basically, you can basically extend what my partner said in his, at the top of his speech. He said that they're basically prioritizing drug use, solving for drug usage over the actual problem in Venezuela. So basically, my opponents are completely misunderstanding what the entire problem in Venezuela actually is. The problem in Venezuela right now is that people are protesting. People are dying in protest because they don't support Maduro's government. And what they're doing here, they're really not addressing the problem head on. All they're doing is that we're gonna solve for this tiny little side benefit rather than addressing the actual problem. So we can see that the plan text is actually not going to be solving anything that's actually going on in Venezuela right now. Not at this time. I'll take it at the end of my speech around the time. Okay. So let's move on to the first advantage where they're talking about where they're going to be decreasing drug usage and stuff. But you can extend the analysis that my partner already made. So he said that Plan Colombia, it did not work right now. So first of all, on the uniqueness, it said that 90% of our cocaine in the United States comes from Venezuela. That's actually not true. 90% of it actually comes from Colombia. But first of all, so they have a factual error right there. But second of all, we can see that when the DEA actually tried to work with Colombia, we've been working with Colombia for the past 20 years in an operation called Plan Colombia. Basically, what we've been doing, we've been funding their police system. We've been sending DEA agents over there, and we've been using these pesticides, as my partner brought up. So, and we can see that like cocaine usage and proliferation has actually gone up 300% in the last 20 years that we've actually like been trying to solve for this cocaine proliferation in Colombia. So we can see, say, even if they do gain access to this DEA solvency, say even if they gain access to this ridiculous link story, saying that for some reason if the rich get like their assets frozen, then somehow that's gonna like force the government to work with the DEA. Like, first of all, there's simply no link there. But second of all, if you do grant them this ridiculous link story, it's not going to work. The DEA is not going to solve for anything. We can see that it only got worse. Like my partner said, these pesticides that they use to try and kill the cocaine plants, it only made things worse. It didn't actually kill any of the cocaine plants. It hurt the indigenous populations. It hurt their food supplies. It hurt their water supplies. And basically, as a result, it's like thousands and thousands of people died as a result of the DEA trying to come in and solve for these drug problems. And this is the only empiric that we can actually look at, because they don't give you any examples where the DEA has actually solved for any like actual drug proliferation cases. So we can see that like this is actually going to be worse, because if the DEA does go in, the situation is going to get worse. Cocaine proliferation is going to get worse, as we can see 300% more as a result of Plan Colombia. So basically they're not going to get access to any of the impacts that are coming off here, such as like better health and human suffering, and so they're not getting access to any of their impacts here because the DEA is simply not going to solve. We can see this through the empiric of Plan Colombia. Moving on to the second advantage by relation. So let's take a look at what they're actually doing with the Plan text. They're putting sanctions on the rich, like mainly the rich. I asked them in a point of information. They said that's mostly the rich, but like there are some people that like are of the lower classes, the middle classes, that are like going to be affected by these sanctions. So they're putting sanctions on the rich people. We can see that like through the trickle down effect. Basically, if the rich people have less money, therefore like it's going to hurt the big businesses in Venezuela right now. So therefore they're not going to be able like to pay their workers, not going to be able to pay wages and such. So it's going to affect every single person in the country. Just because you're putting the sanctions on the rich doesn't mean that the poor or the middle class are going to be completely unaffected. It's still going to affect every single person in the country because of the trickle down effect. So we can see perceptually this is going to be really bad for the United States-Venezuela relations, because we can see that the people are going to say, hey, the United States tanked our economy. Why should we like them? Why should we want to have like a good relation with them? Why should we sell our oil to them? We can see that basically, like, you can look to the empiric of Iran. We can see that we put sanctions on Iran like years ago, and we basically completely destroyed their economy. And now like Iran, like we know that Iran hates us right now. We can see that like we're only just starting to get out of the hole that we've dug ourselves in for the past like 50 years with the Iranian international relations. So we can see the sanctions actually make people hate the United States a lot more, because we're basically like tanking their economy by hurting the rich. Like we're not going to be able to help. Like we're going to be hurting the poor as well. So we can see that, like, again, they're not going to be wanting to trade with the United States if we're putting sanctions on them. So again, they're saying that only the rich, they're putting only sanctions on the rich, so therefore somehow they're getting access to like people. They said, so the rich, I asked them at a point of information, like, why would the rich be affected by this? They said that the poor people are actually going to be affected by these sanctions. So they're basically right here, they're conceding in my point of information that the poor people are going to be affected by the tanking economy in Venezuela as well. So you can completely, like, you can turn this point on them. We can see that we're actually going to have worse relations with Iran because, not Iran. We're going to have worse relations with Venezuela because we can see that we're going to be tanking their economy. So therefore, every single person in the country is going to be hurt, including the people of the lower classes. The same analysis can be used for Advantage 3, where they said that the United States looks good. They said they're going to be reducing terrorism. There's really like no issue with Venezuelan terrorism on like United States people, so there's really no impact there, or like there's no link or impact there. So they said only 31% of people support the United States right now. But again, we can see that if we're going to be tanking the Venezuelan economy, they're going to support us much less, because like you can simply see that the United States is this like big international bully that's tanking our economy. So they're not going to want to have any good relations with us. So move on to the AC, where we're talking about the oil shock. So they try to turn this. They said that it hurts Venezuela more, but at this point they're basically conceding that it hurts both countries here. So they conceded the statistic that we showed you, that we're going to be losing $300 billion in like oil. So basically they're conceding that it hurts the United States as well. It hurts the United States in the amount of $300 billion, but it hurts Venezuela as well. So when they're saying it hurts Venezuela more, they're conceding the fact that we're going to be tanking their economy, and that they're like, as a result of that, perceptions from the Venezuelan people are going to view the United States as much worse. Moving on to the second point about violence, they said there's actually going to be less violence. They didn't provide you with any analysis or link story here, so again, let me just extend the contention. So Maduro's going like light on the protesters right now. He's not really using that much force right now, but we can see that if the United States cuts off ties, if we put sanctions on them, he has no one to appeal to. He has no one to like look favorable to. So he's going to authorize the use of violence and like weapons on the protesters. So much more people are going to die. They said this doesn't link because this is only speculation, but we can see like it's clear and simple logic. If he has no one to appeal to, then obviously he's going to be turning to much more radical methods to end the protests in Venezuela. So moving on to the counter plan, they said that it's non-topical. They brought up this topicality shell, but they don't really realize that a counterplan doesn't have to be topical. If we have to run a topical counterplan in every single round, then basically like we're going to be buying into most of the affirmative ground, which is completely unfair to us. So on the A point, their interpretation that we have to be on topic, but again, remember that a counterplan does not have to be topical. So again, yeah, we don't have to be topical, and like C, they on these standards, they said that they're actually losing ground. There's actually no articulated abuse. There's no articulated abuse. They didn't give you a single contention or an argument that they couldn't run as a result of lost ground. So therefore, you're not going to be buying into their topicality because they simply didn't lose any ground here, so no abuse actually happened. So they don't gain access to any of their voters of fairness or education. They conceded both advantages under the counterplan. So basically, their only argument under the counterplan is that like it's not topical. But remember, it doesn't have to be topical, and they didn't lose any ground. So you're going to be buying the counterplan as legitimate. And they conceded both of the advantages under the counterplan. One, which was that Venezuela improves, and two, that Catholicism is going to spread altruism and charity. And because they conceded both of the advantages under the counterplan, you can be voting on the counterplan before the plan because they didn't like have any actual responses to it. And for all these reasons, you could be voting for the negation. Thank you.
I get the timer.
Alright, so the order is going to be just, actually there's no order, it's just voting issues. So, is everyone ready?
Yeah.
Alright, I'll start my time now. The first reason to vote neg is that we actually make some attempt at stopping the protests in Venezuela. And my opponents, their entire AC is built off the assumption that what we should be prioritizing in Venezuela is drug trade. But let me explain why like stabilizing the government always outweighs drug trade. Because a drug trade can't even function in an illegitimate government. So if we have a drug trade and we see that the government is actually able to do anything with that because they're illegitimate, that's why nothing's going to work. That's why we have to make sure that stabilization is always there before we even look towards things like drug trade. But secondly, we stop the violence. We gain a means of like actually putting the two parties together and making them like have some way of trying to work things out. Nothing in the entire AC links to solving the actual conflict in Venezuela. They want to focus on drug trade, but remember, stabilizing government relations and stabilizing what's actually happening in Venezuela is going to outweigh each and every single time. Second, they provide absolutely no warrants. The entire AF plan is built off of speculation and analysis, whereas the neg gives you empirics and actual statements made by Maduro. So what we have here on both sides is the analysis of some high schoolers versus things that were actually said and done by Maduro. And because we're only left to assume that the outcomes of when these things actually happen were bad, that means that they somewhere in their analysis that they went wrong, because each and every single time, the only empiric that we can provide you under the DEA and how like they tried to stop drug trade in Venezuela before, or sorry, the Latin America, is Plan Colombia. And because they don't really provide any adequate refutation to Plan Colombia, you're always going to assume that in any single instance of DEA intervention in Latin America, things are always going to go bad because they don't cite any evidence saying that the DEA is going to resort to some other means of like stopping the drug trade. We're only left to assume that they're going to be flying the same planes, using the same pesticides to kill the same people. So obviously that's a bad thing that's obviously going to make the US look bad. So the third reason to vote neg is because of US hegemony. Because they don't provide you any like sort of warrant that their plan is actually going to be solving anything relating to drug trade or the protests in general. That's why you're going to be voting them down. Because instead of what's happening, they're only going to be harming the indigenous people of Venezuela. They're not going to be mitigating the drug trade at all. They don't provide you any warrants, any analysis, or any reason to believe that the drug trade would go down as a result of their plan. And because drug trade doesn't go down as a result of the plan, and they're only going to be ending up hurting the indigenous people and not actually doing what they accomplished, not actually doing what they intended to accomplish, that's a reason why US hedge is going to go down. There is absolutely no reason why US hedge would go bad under a faulty plan that hasn't worked in Colombia, and that they give no reason why it would work in Venezuela. But rather, you're going to be voting up the negation on US hedge because we tell you explicitly, or sorry, we don't have anything linked to US hedge, but we're going to be promoting Vatican City hedge in general, which is always better because there aren't any geopolitical interests involved. The US is heavily involved in Venezuelan oil, so obviously there's a biased interest here. However, Vatican City and the Pope and Cardinal Pietro Parolin only look to mitigate the conflict. They don't really care about they don't have any vested interest in Venezuelan oil, drugs, or the economy. They just want to talk things out. And ultimately, that's going to be like improving their image a lot more than the AC is going to be improving the image of the US economy. I'll take your first point of information.
Yes, you say that you don't have any empirical evidence for DEA, but when the DEA got out of Venezuela, why did the cocaine trafficking through Venezuela quadruple?
Because that shows how effective that shows how ineffective the DEA is. If they leave Venezuela, if they act in, like, the DEA never stays in like a country for any period of time. Rather, what they do is look towards Plan Colombia. They intervene in one single instance and then they leave. And because they intervene in this one instance and then the drug trade proliferated, it quadrupled, that shows right there that the DEA is inefficient, nothing actually happens. Now the fifth voting issue is, let's just address this really quick topicality issue. First of all, the CP doesn't have to be topical once again. It's not like we have to propose another plan that's completely topical. As long as the CP is competitive on net benefits, it makes it a perfectly legitimate counterplan. But secondly, onto their topicality argument, they never address an instance of articulated abuse. Their entire theory argument is built on the assumption that in some way they lose some sort of access to some arguments. But those arguments are never explicitly stated in either of the two affirmation speeches. So you're never going to be voting on the topicality issue. Instead, you're going to be turning the topicality issue because it's essentially all it's done is waste time in today's debate. Instead of actually addressing the main voters in today's round, I have to spend time on this topicality argument that shouldn't have even been run in the first place. But fourth, on to the Venezuelan and U.S. economy, they blatantly concede that in the instance of the affirmative plan, in the instance of the status quo, they concede that both countries are hurt. Because once again, Venezuelan oil, the U.S. is heavily dependent on Venezuelan oil right now, but if protests go bad in Venezuela and nothing is there to stop them, but the CP is stopping them, then we're only left to assume that the U.S. or Venezuela is going to stop the oil shipments and follow through with what Maduro originally intended to be and stop the oil shipments to the U.S. economy. And both economies are going to be hurt here because, once again, Venezuela is going to lose a large customer and the U.S. is going to lose a majority of its oil. So it's for all these reasons that I strongly urge a vote in favor of the negation. Thank you.
Is everyone ready? So I just have 2 voters today. Let's go ahead and start time. Voting issue number 1 is going to be that of the theory about their non-topical counterplan. Let's quickly review what we ran against them. Subpoint A, inter, we said they simply can't run a non-topical counterplan. We'll get into this later and explain this, but subpoint B, violation, they did. Subpoint C, standard, we argue this takes away ground, and pretty much the reason it takes away ground is because it makes the debate unfair. It makes it unbalanced towards the negation team. All they did was they took one part of the resolution, Venezuela, ignored the rest, and ran a counterplan on it. Let me give you an analogy. For example, if the resolution was the United States federal government should raise the federal minimum wage, they could have run, oh, China should raise the minimum wage as a non-topical counterplan. Well, pretty much that has nothing to do with what we're discussing. That eliminates clash from the debate. They in no way showed how their plan was competitive in terms of mutual exclusion. We can run both plans at the same time. Yeah, I'll take your question.
So assuming that both plans are trying to solve the problem of the protests in Venezuela, why can't we run a different plan that isn't economic sanctions?
Yeah, Judge, that's a problem. They said that protests are a huge problem in Venezuela. Okay, we understand that, but we defined our key problem is the drug trafficking in Venezuela. They tried to ignore it as a side problem, but we don't think that's a side problem. 28,000 people are dying every single year because of the drug trade in Venezuela alone, and countless individuals are dying within the United States as well. It's a big problem. That's the one we targeted, and they tried to target a completely different problem, eliminated clash from today's debate. So let's go right into subpoint D, and that's our voting issues. You should be voting on. You should be punishing the negation team in 2 ways. First and foremost, at the very least, you should be dropping their counterplan because it's unfair for them to run a non-topical counterplan that has only something to do with one minute part of the debate. It doesn't even solve the same inherency as the affirmative team proposed. But also, you should be voting on this in terms of education. They restricted discussion on the actual topic.
This voter on education is completely new. It could have really been said when the theory argument was first introduced.
My partner did mention that.
Fairness and education.
Yeah, my partner did mention both fairness and education, saying how this harmed the educationality of today's round because it restricted the discussion on economic sanctions, pretty much taken by the United States and Venezuela. We were supposed to be discussing how the United States should impose economic sanctions on Venezuela. Instead, they shifted the discussion about things about the Vatican City, and pretty much it's a real-world impact. So it should take immediate precedence over everything that was brought up hypothetically. So even if you don't feel like voting on education in today's round, at the very least drop their counterplan on terms of fairness because it is completely non-topical. With that being said, let's go into our second voting issue, and that's of the drug war. Pretty much we're only going to be weighing on this because it's by far the largest impact impact in today's round. Let's go ahead and start with what we said on terms of drugs. We said the DEA has worked in the past. Before 2005, the DEA was extremely effective in terms of shutting down the passing of drugs through Venezuela. Now, after they left, this quadrupled. They haven't pretty much mentioned this statistic a single time. They say again and again, we have brought no evidence of how this was actually successful, how the DEA was successful. This is direct evidence. We said the DEA was there, it left, and after it left, the drug trade quadrupled. Now, the only response they brought up to this, and they hammered it again and again, was that Planet Colombia didn't work. Planet Colombia didn't work. They said we miscited evidence saying that because we're getting the vast majority of our cocaine from Colombia. However, we're not saying we're getting our cocaine from Venezuela. We're saying the cocaine passes through Venezuela, which is very, very important. 90% of the cocaine that's coming to the United States actually passes through Venezuela, and if it can't pass through Venezuela anymore because the DEA is destroying the trafficking agencies over there, then we're actually going to be solving the problem. So their point of Planet Colombia is pretty much irrelevant. Colombia is not Venezuela. Yeah.
In the first speech, it was said that our 90% of our cocaine comes from Venezuela, and so this clarification could have really been brought up earlier.
Yeah, we said 90% of our cocaine comes through Venezuela. That means it's just passing through there, not that it's actually grown there. We never made the argument that, or we're creating the cocaine in Venezuela and bringing it here. We just said it passes through there. And if we can stop this, stop it going through this entry point, then that can lead to enormous impacts. Now, pretty much to invalidate Planet Colombia, Colombia is not Venezuela. We already showed how the DEA worked in Venezuela, and therefore our evidence should take immediate precedence over theirs. But also they cited that sanctions won't necessarily work, they might cause backlash, but the negation team's second speaker cited the example of Iran. They said pretty much what happened in Iran was because sanctions reduced the popularity of citizens actually there. Even if we conceded that, you can say, okay, even if this is true, if pretty much Venezuelans won't like the United States for putting the sanctions, let's actually look at the example of Iran. What happened? Iran started negotiating. These sanctions started to work. This is a clear and direct example of how American sanctions on another country started to work and started enacting results. So turn their own example against them. So with that being said, we can clearly see that drugs is a big argument in today's round. 28,000 people die in Venezuela every single year, on top of 5,000 people within the United States because of this. Also, they dropped all of our analysis on our first speech on why you should be valuing lives over improving the quality of lives, because pretty much you can't improve the quality of life without life actually there. So life ought to take precedence over that. The only example of loss of life they cited was 36 individuals dying pretty much because of political protest. Because 28,000 is greater than 36, you should vote for the affirmative team today.
Innovate.
Do you want to go through the line?
No. I don't know where I'm going yet either.
Okay, I voted neg, and this is because although I don't think the counter plan, I think you guys missed the mutual exclusivity part. They didn't bring that up the entire debate until the very last speech, which I don't I'm not going to regard that as a valid argument because they could have said that any of those speeches. And then if you guys had included the mutual exclusivity, I might have just ignored the counter plan completely. I don't think the way you guys approached it using theory was particularly adequate, especially because as they noted, there was no articulated abuse in round. You guys still used every single one of your arguments, and they weren't oh, we're getting out of these, you know what I mean? And then you could have, as I said, just said the mutual exclusivity thing. And then aside from that, I think the Colombia evidence, just proving with the DEA didn't really help. They didn't say it in round, but the result of the DEA in Colombia was is the entire drug war in Mexico right now, you know what I mean? So I don't think you guys really refuted the fact that the DEA could solve. You just kind of provided this correlation evidence. Once the DEA left, it quadrupled, but that wasn't big enough. That wasn't a big enough warrant for me to believe that, I guess. Especially with how they're talking about all these pesticides and ruining the economy. Yeah. Aside from that,
Yeah, I voted neg too. I feel the theory, the topicality argument that you ran, that counter plans must be topical, is going to be a really hard uphill battle for you. 10 years ago it might not have been, but most people now agree that counter plans don't need to be topical. Also, if you are going to run this theory, don't run it with ground, run it with limit standards. It'll be a lot more powerful, because you can say that they delimit this argument and it completely blows the lid off of whatever, they can do whatever they want at this point. I feel like it's a lot more of a powerful argument than it removes ground, or it explodes ground. In either case, you need to put more than one answer on the counterplan too, before the last speech. Just saying that the counterplan is not topical and just going on with it, I feel like that's not a good enough answer. And even though the counterplan isn't mutually exclusive, if there's another option other than the affirmative at the end of the round, I have to vote for it. On the other arguments, I feel like the inherency or the uniqueness story on the dissad, the violence dissad, is really sketchy. Like, really sketchy. If you guys had called them out on that, I think it would have been really easy to kind of discard this dissad. On the oil shock, oil shock was, I eventually just gave that to the neg too. Partially as a net benefit to the counterplan, because of the geopolitical argument that they made. In order for you to answer this argument, I feel like you're going to need to attack the internal links in a way that you didn't. You said that the plan reduces the terrorists, and you have this argument about Venezuela, but it may reduce terrorism in Venezuela, but that's not the argument they're making. They're making the argument that terrorism is going to be occurring in OPEC countries and not in Venezuela. So you need to attack kind of that internal link chain if you want to really take out that dissent. On the AF, just add more empirics and it should be fine. I would have liked to see a lot more offense from the neg team. You kind of went for defense on the AF. Offense will serve you a lot better.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much. Thanks for judging.
Appreciate it.